Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. The Nahanni is arguably one of Canada's most famous and most treacherous rivers, and the land around it, a place of legend. Just look at a map and you'll see names that suggest a dark and dangerous history. The Funeral Range, Broken Skull River, the Vampire Peaks, Deadmen Valley. That last one can be traced back almost 100 years to a single event, when the bodies of two brothers were discovered in the valley several years after they went missing. Since then, stories of a number of similar, seemingly mysterious deaths have given the entire Nahanni region the unofficial but popular nickname of the Headless Valley. Now this is a big episode, and I don't just mean its length. First, with this episode, Fireside Canada has now officially covered at least one story from every province and territory in the country. Second, the legendary Headless Valley has been covered countless times by people with much larger platforms than this show. There's already so much out there recycling the same information that it really made me wonder if it was worth covering. I mean, could I add anything new, or would I simply be repeating what everyone else has been repeating for the last 100 years? Thankfully, I think I can offer a fresh perspective, and possibly a little more clarity about a story that has, as the best ones do, grown a little wild and hazy. But before that, let's learn about this legendary region and how it earned that unsettling nickname. This is the story of the Headless Valley. In January of 1947, in the depths of a record-breaking winter, beloved Canadian writer Pierre Berton, then a fledgling reporter with the Vancouver Sun newspaper, boarded a plane and ventured into the frozen wilds of the Nahanni Valley, a chain of towering mountains and ancient vales carved into the southwestern reaches of the Northwest Territories. The trip was a harrowing one, punctuated by severe winter storms and more than a few narrow escapes. The weather was so cold that he and his companions had to literally cook the plane's battery in a cast iron oven and thaw its engine with a blowtorch before takeoff. At nearly every stop along the way, they were warned to give up and turn back, lest they add to the region's tally of tragic deaths and disappearances. Why would they risk their lives to come to such a remote, inhospitable place at such a treacherous time of year? Like countless others before them, they had gone to the north looking for fame and fortune. But unlike all the others, it wasn't for gold or valuable furs or even a hunting trophy. They were searching for a legend, and for answers to a mystery that was over 40 years in the making. Part 2. The Legend of Deadmen Valley. The McLeod brothers grew up dreaming of gold. Born and raised in the late 1800s at Fort Liard, a riverside trading post in the Northwest Territories, they cut their teeth and learned their trade in the rolling foothills of the Mackenzie Mountains, roughly 40 kilometers north and east of the British Columbia and Yukon borders, respectively. As sons of the fort's chief factor, Murdoch McLeod, and a local Indigenous woman, they became experts in all of the necessary skills it takes to carve out a life in the North, like hunting, tracking, trapping, canoeing, prospecting, and perhaps most importantly, communicating with the many people from many walks of life who tumbled into and out of the Hudson's Bay fort like driftwood on the river. Nestled on the terrace of two major rivers, Fort Liard has served as an important gathering place for at least 10,000 years. Long before it was a trading post, people would travel there to trade goods and share the latest news from all corners of the North. In fact, according to local tradition, so many people would gather there that if you lined up all of the spruce bark canoes end to end, you'd be able to fashion a floating bridge and cross from one side of the Liard River to the other, a distance of no less than half a kilometer. It was in this millennia-old tradition that, sometime around the turn of the 20th century, an old Indigenous trapper shared with Murdoch a bit of tantalizing news. gold had been struck by a group of indigenous prospectors working somewhere up the Flat River within the Nahanni Valley. News like this could be as valuable and tradable as a foxskin, especially at the time when thousands of hopeful prospectors were tearing up the Klondike in search of a payload that had, for the most part, already been claimed. When Fred, Willie, Frank, and the rest of the McLeod boys heard the tale from their father over the supper table that evening, the idea for a grand and fateful adventure began to take shape. The notion that a fortune in gold might lay hidden somewhere in their own backyard fascinated the young McLeods, and they spent much of the final years of their boyhood obsessing over how they might retrieve this hidden treasure. It would be years before they would have the chance. By 1903, Fred had taken over his father's position as chief factor, while the rest of the family had moved south. The flow of time, together with the veritable flood of responsibilities that come with adulthood, had all but worn away the dream of finding Nahanni gold. Until one day, when a strange man wandered through the gates of Fort Liard and paid a sizable bill of sale with a handful of solid gold nuggets, which he had poured from a poke around his neck. Eyes wide with wonder, Fred urged the man to reveal how and where he had found the gold. After a bit of friendly persuasion, the prospector finally yielded an answer. Inside the Nahanni Valley, a few kilometers up the Flat River. In that moment, the spirit of discovery that had kept the McLeod brothers dreaming and scheming during the cold winter nights of their youth was reignited. And suddenly, their dream of striking it rich seemed shockingly within reach. That night, he wrote to his brothers and encouraged them to return home. Fred's older brother, Willie, was the first to respond. Tossing a few of his things together, he left Edmonton, Alberta, and headed northwest to Fort Nelson, BC. There, he joined with another McLeod sibling, Frank, and together they were soon panning the countless creeks that fed into the Flat River. That first expedition was a moderate success. They returned in the spring with enough gold to cover their costs, live comfortably for a while, and gamble the rest away. They decided to try again the following year, and in January of 1904, Willie and Frank returned to the Nahanni, this time with their younger brother Charlie in tow. They took the long way this time. West by train to the rain-slicked streets of Vancouver, north by boat through the mist-shrouded Inside Passage to the Alaskan Panhandle, and finally east by snowshoe and dog sled through deserted mining camps and across the frozen ice of the Yukon and back into the Nahanni Valley, where they met a group of friendly indigenous miners who were pulling nuggets the size of chicken eggs, worth roughly $2 to $3 each, from their hand-hewn sluice boxes. Encouraged by what the others had found, they quickly set up camp. The McLeods panned up and down the Flat River throughout the spring and summer, and though they didn't strike it rich, they apparently found enough gold to keep their spirits high for 2 solid seasons. When there was more gold on the trees than they found in their pans, they knew it was time to leave. They grabbed 2 sluice boxes that the indigenous prospectors had left by the creek and combined them together to form a crude, box-shaped boat, which they hoped would carry them safely home. Things didn't go as planned. About 30 kilometers downriver, the brothers arrived at a canyon, which author R.M. Patterson called as dirty a piece of water as you could wish to see. There, the river roils and foams over a particularly nasty set of rapids known as the Cascade of the 13 Steps. The first step was enough to swamp their ramshackle vessel, and the remaining 12 carried away nearly everything they had: their food, their shelter, and their gold. But luck didn't abandon them entirely. Willie had managed to secure a small bottle of gold in a sash around his waist, and Charlie had managed to rustle a waterlogged rifle and 30-odd shells from the grasp of the frigid river. The brothers trudged back to the creek, shot a moose for supper, and crafted yet another sluice box boat. They learned from their mistakes, however. This time, they portaged around the worst of the rapids, using a heavy moose hide rope to lower their boat safely down the canyons. They made it home to Fort Liard just before winter set in. The McLeods had ventured twice into dangerous country and lived to tell the tale, though the second time they had barely escaped with their lives. They should have stopped while they were ahead, but that was virtually impossible for men like Willie and Frank. To quote R.M. Patterson, "No prospector can ever permanently settle down. As he works at some humdrum job, he keeps running over his last trip in his mind and building up new theories. He can soon see what mistakes he made, just where he took the wrong line, and exactly what he ought to have done." The gold was out there, somewhere. The proof was in that little bottle that Willie had managed to save. They and others had found it waiting for them in the sand and soil of the creek beds. Now all they had to do was find its source. In the early months of 1905, Willie and Frank McLeod set out once again into the Nahanni Valley for a third and final time. They would never make it out alive. A year went by without any word from the brothers, but the family weren't overly concerned. A sudden flood or cold snap could lock up the valley and make it impenetrable. In that case, as seasoned outdoorsmen, Willie and Frank would be more than capable of hunkering down and waiting for spring. By 1907, however, things seemed dire. Fred McLeod, now the chief factor at Fort Providence, had received word that an empty canoe had been found drifting in the South Nahanni River, and the family began to fear the worst. Finally, Charlie McLeod, the younger brother who had accompanied Willie and Frank on their second journey, returned to the valley, this time with a search party. The wind howled over the cliffs and down across the water as they followed an old trail into the north. After a half-day's journey, the group found a series of ash piles, the remnants of old campfires. Each campfire sat at the bottom of a tree, and each tree held a blaze, a patch where the bark had been cut away, and a message, written in pencil, that contained the date and two sets of initials, WM and FM. They were close. After a few more kilometers upriver, the party found the lost McLeod brothers, or what was left of them, back in the brush within a deep shadowed valley between the first and second canyon, nearly 1,500 kilometers from their home. The tattered remains of their camp sat beneath a large spruce tree on the left bank of the Nahanni River. At its center, near the black remains of a long, cold campfire, lay two weathered skeletons. A ring and watch found nearby was quickly identified as the personal effects of Frank McLeod. The position and state of their bodies suggested they had experienced a sudden and violent end. One brother was lying on his back in his bed. His breastbone was shattered, leading some to speculate that he was shot at close range with a rifle as he slept. The other brother was out of bed and lying on his stomach 3 feet away. His blankets were thrown half across the other man, as if he had left his bed in a hurry. His right arm was extended, as if reaching for the rifle that sat at the foot of a nearby tree. One more step, and he would have had it. Most disturbing of all was the fact that both their heads were missing. Someone or something had removed them. Though it was impossible to tell exactly how they died, their bodies and clothing had long since decomposed, or whether an animal or human was responsible for the grisly state of the bodies, Charlie and the 6 others in his party couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had transpired. Some speculated that a killer may have snuck into their camp during the night and murdered the first brother while he slept. The following commotion may have woken the second brother, who leapt from his bed and ran for his rifle before the assailant killed him, too. There was evidence of a possible motive as well. At the base of a nearby tree sat the remains of another blaze, which, at one point, seemed to hint at the location of a promising gold mine. But someone had felled the tree and scratched the bark so badly that most of the writing was illegible. A second message, discovered a short distance from camp, scrawled in pencil along the side of a broken sled runner, was as short as it was mysterious. "We have found a fine prospect." Word of the McLeod's demise traveled quickly, and soon the area tucked between First and Second Canyon was officially designated Dead Men Valley, while the stream that ran quietly past their campsite became Headless Creek, names they still carry today. The sensational news, and equally sensational name, sparked a significant amount of imagination and speculation. At Fort Simpson, several kilometers northeast of the Nahanni, on the banks of the mighty Mackenzie River, rumor had it that Willie and Frank were tied to trees and decapitated. Storytellers were divided about whether any gold had been found with their bodies. Some said that a fair amount of gold-flaked quartz lay close by, evidence that the brothers had discovered a rich, mineable vein of gold somewhere in the valley. Others said that there was no trace of gold whatsoever, and that, if Willie's last message was to be believed, the murderer must have stolen whatever gold the brothers had discovered, along with their heads. If the crime was murder, and the motive was gold, then who was the murderer? Many pointed the finger at a mysterious third man, a Scottish steamboat captain with a name that no one seems to agree on. It's either Green, Wade, Ware, or Wilkinson. Whatever his name, it seems that he had teamed up with Willie and Frank on their doomed expedition after being shown either the vial of placer gold that Willie had collected from a Nahanni Creek, or a gold watch chain that the brothers had crafted for their brother Fred. Many theorized that he murdered his partners in cold blood, hoping to keep their legendary find all to himself. Exactly what happened to him after the murder? Well, that's where the stories differ. Some claimed that the culprit had been seen in Telegraph Creek in northwestern British Columbia, living life to the fullest, thanks to the $8,000 worth of gold dust and nuggets he had packed into town. Others said that the police had tracked him all the way to Vancouver until his trail went cold, though there seems to be no official record to support either of those theories. A few years after Willie and Frank were discovered, another skeleton was found, this time fully intact, slightly upriver from their camp. According to several reports, the RCMP and many others believed that the remains belonged to that third man. But Charlie McLeod didn't agree. Decades later, Charlie told the press that he had managed to track down this third man, this murderer, who he called Robert Ware, to an Alberta farm east of Edmonton. According to the story, the man killed himself in the barn before Charlie could bring him to justice. The supposed steamboat captain wasn't the only suspect, of course. The Nahanni Valley is remote and isolated, but it wasn't entirely devoid of human life. Many indigenous people constantly moved throughout the region, as they had been for roughly 10,000 years, hunting, trapping, and now panning for gold. Trappers of European descent routinely worked the area as well, building cabins beside the legendary hot springs of the valley and working their trap lines all winter long. And of course, decades of vague rumors of gold-filled creeks and fertile valleys ensured that at least a handful of desperate prospectors journeyed north every year, each hoping to stumble upon their very own fortune. Any one of them could have had the motive and the means to murder Willie and Frank McLeod, and that would have been a sufficient explanation for most who heard the story, except for one confounding question. Why would anyone take their heads? That question, along with other strange events in the valley's long history, have led some to theorize that something more sinister, and perhaps supernatural, is to blame. Part 3. Mysterious Ends. The McLeods may have been the first outsiders on record to die under mysterious circumstances within the Nahanni Valley, but they weren't the last. The discovery of their headless skeletons and the hints at a virtual bonanza lying somewhere in Dead Men Valley became headline news, and while some took the story as just one more reason why they should avoid the north, others were intrigued. In the years that followed, a number of hopeful explorers ventured into the valley. Many would soon add to the body count. In 1912, a prospector named Martin Jorgensen sent word to his partner, Poole Field, a former police officer, that he had struck it rich somewhere up the Flat River. In his letter, Jorgensen urged Field to come find him as quickly as possible, and included a map showing him how to get to his cabin. Field left as soon as he was able, and in the fall of 1914, he discovered the bleached skeleton of his friend lying halfway between the riverbank and the ashes of his former cabin. The details of exactly what Field found that day are hazy. Some say that Jorgensen's rifle was missing. Others that it was lying by his side along with 2 spent cartridges. Many claim that, just like the McLeods, Martin Jorgensen's head was missing. In 1928, another skeleton was discovered near the same creek where many believed Willie and Frank McLeod had found their gold. Though no one could say for certain, many speculated that it belonged to a Klondike prospector known as Yukon Fisher. The details are hazy, but some claim that, again, the skull was nowhere to be found. In 1929, the body of Martin O'Brien, a seasoned trapper and veteran of the First World War, was discovered. He still had his head, but his death seemed strange just the same. He was still upright, matchbook in hand, frozen solid, crouched over a campfire he never had a chance to light. In 1932 or 33, another burned-down cabin and another corpse, not far from where Jorgensen was found. This time, the body belonged to an elite trapper and expert woodsman named Phil Powers. The state in which he was found is, also like Jorgensen, up for debate. Some say that he, too, was headless, and that the remnants of a firearm lay nearby. Others say that it was impossible to tell. The fire had burned so hot and for so long that most of his body and his cabin had been reduced to ash. These are just a few in a very long list, though exactly how long seems to be a matter of opinion. Depending on who you ask, as many as 20, 40, or even 50 people have either been found dead or never found at all after they vanished into the mists of the fabled Nahanni Valley. The actual number seems far less, and it seems that only 1 or 2 were actually missing their heads. A lot of YouTubers, podcasters, and authors will tell you in their best spooky voice things like, "Their deaths have never been fully explained," or "No one knows who was responsible for these horrific mutilations or what became of the other missing people." But that's not entirely true. The Northwest Mounted Police and later the RCMP seem very sure. They investigated the most well-recorded cases, including that of the McLeods, and came to the same conclusion for all of them. The valley had taken their lives. Not in some supernatural sense, but in one that is decidedly natural. As anyone who spent time up there will tell you, the northern wilderness is a dangerous place where just one mistake can mean the difference between life and death for even the most seasoned of outdoorsmen. Not just the investigators, but a lot of local experts, trappers, hunters, and traders who had lived there for decades were firm in their belief that the McLeods, Jorgensen, Fisher, Powers, and most of the others had also succumbed to either starvation, scurvy, or a bear attack. Even members of the McLeod family agreed that Willie, Frank, and their third mysterious partner had simply starved to death. They had most likely lost their canoe in the turbulent waters of the Nahanni River, along with most of their supplies and ammunition. Wild animals had shattered one of their breastbones and escaped with their heads, a relatively common practice for scavengers. Yet for some, that answer wasn't enough. The sheer number of supposed deaths and disappearances, along with the bizarre details of many of those cases, suggested that the land might be cursed, and that anyone who dared to dig for gold would soon find themselves about 11 pounds lighter. There were questions that demanded further investigation. For example, if a wild animal had indeed scavenged from the remains of the McLeods, why were only their heads missing? In most other cases where wolves, bears, or other beasts had discovered the bodies, some of the remains would be scattered throughout the scene, while the rest would undoubtedly be carried back to the creature's den. How would a man, a veteran of the First World War, freeze to death over a campfire that he was moments away from igniting? For some, the answer might lie in the deepest, darkest, and most primeval parts of the valley. Part 4. Madness. One summer in the 1920s, a young woman named May Annie Lafferty suddenly disappeared. Now, that isn't altogether strange. One of the area's nicknames is the Valley of Vanishing Men. But the way that May disappeared is especially odd. May was the cousin of Poole Field's wife, Mary, and the three were on their way back to a trading post after a long winter spent hunting and trapping in the backcountry. May had been acting strangely for some time, so when Poole Field was told that she had gone missing from camp, he might not have been surprised. What did surprise him, however, was the uncanny speed with which she seemed to move across the harsh and unforgiving terrain. The Fields had been trapping and camping with a large number of hunters who were indigenous to the area. 5 of them in particular, Diamond C, Boston Jack, Charlie Yohe, or Yohin, George Tesu, and Big Charlie, were almost legendary for their tracking skills. Poole set out that day with all 5 men, confident that they would quickly find the girl and bring her home. They found her tracks easily enough. Small, slight moccasin prints that led upriver into the hills. They followed those footprints for 9 days, hunting for every meal and sleeping only a few hours each night, yet they were never able to catch up. It seemed like the girl never stopped to eat or to sleep. There would be brief moments where she seemed to stand and rest on her feet, but then she was off again, across a sandbar and into the bush. Soon they began to find articles of clothing, a jacket, a shirt, even the moccasins she had worn, until they were certain that she must be completely naked, except for a few thin strips of moose hide that she had wrapped around her feet. On the 5th day came the cliffs, so high and so sheer that the seasoned hunters were afraid to climb them. Yet the girl seemed to have scaled them with ease. By the 9th day, the men had exhausted their supply of ammunition and had to turn back. They had tracked her as far as the canyon that led to Dead Men Valley. A small creek in the area was named in her memory. In English, it's known simply as May Creek. In Dene, it's Tsel Etzodetla Dehe, Little Girl Lost Creek. May Annie Lafferty was quickly written off by both the police and reporters like Pierre Berton, who, in the most dismissive 1940s way possible, declared the Métis girl to be, quote, a mental case, end quote, and later, a half-wit. Apparently, Berton felt that was a sufficient explanation for his readers. The girl, who had already had a history of odd behavior, was feeling desperately homesick. Some said that the Fields treated her like a slave and that she fled in desperation. Whatever her motive for leaving camp, it's possible that her state of mind was even more disturbed by the extreme environment and crushing sense of isolation that she encountered over the course of that long, dark winter. The girl had snapped. That sometimes happens in the North. And it might come as no surprise to learn that there are many stories of people getting lost or going mad within the Nahanni Valley. One prospector told a story about how he visited a friend and fellow outdoorsman and found him pale and emaciated, jabbering to himself in the dark and yelling at invisible terrors. He had built a bizarre altar on the top of a mountain intended for a sacrifice. There are other stories of men being struck with a sort of paralyzing paranoia, refusing to go outside or even look their visitors in the eye. They would spend weeks at a time curled up in their beds, facing the wall, refusing to eat. When visitors came, they would speak only to their shadows. And then there are stories of groups of skillful hunters striding into the valley, brimming with confidence, only to crawl out a year later ragged, traumatized, and fewer in number. Some had barely survived by eating the rotting carcasses of dogs and caribou. Another had found a quick end by wandering out into the snow with a lit stick of dynamite. It seemed that everyone who lived in the Nahanni Valley for an extended period of time had at least one story about a fellow outdoorsman who was driven insane, whether by scurvy, loneliness, or the constant howling of the northern wind. But questions still remain, many of which can never be answered. What terror did these seasoned outdoorsmen see, or imagine they could see, that would drive them indoors where they would literally waste away? What god was the strange altar meant to appease? And what about May? What exactly happened to her? She might have indeed wandered from her campsite on her own accord, but how could this inexperienced, ill-equipped young girl with only a half-day head start successfully evade expert trackers for over 9 days through rough, nearly impassable terrain? A century later, it seems we're no closer to a satisfying answer. Perhaps the MacLeods and their partner went mad and either killed each other or themselves. Perhaps, as some contend, they were the victims of an insane serial killer who lost their mind to hunger, cold, or the constant howl of the wind. Perhaps it was madness. But there are other theories as well. Part 5. Myths and Monsters. For generations, the Dene of the Deh-Cho, or as it is more commonly known today, the Mackenzie River, would travel each winter to where the Mackenzie meets the Liard. There, where the village of Fort Simpson now sits, they would dismantle their boats and trade away the skins and furs, then follow the herds of caribou as they migrated across the mountains into the slightly warmer climes of the South Nahanni River. It was while they were wintering in the shadows of this deep and ancient valley that the Naha, the mountain dene, for which the valley is named, would descend from the rocky cliffs to raid and burn down their camps, steal their food, and, some say, kidnap women and children. Dene had enough and decided to strike back. Gathering their fiercest and most talented hunters, they sharpened their weapons, and, when the moon was set and the darkness was at its thickest, they crept quietly up the mountainside and into the camps of the Naha. Then the Dene grew nervous. They expected to hear the soft snores of their enemy, or maybe a few low voices muffled by their animal skin shelters. Instead, they heard nothing but the wind whistling down the mountainside. They suddenly felt exposed. The Naha fires were still burning. Their own shadows danced in the firelight, but there was no other movement. Keeping one eye on the tree line for any signs of an ambush, the Dene spread out, moved to the teepees, peeled open the doors, and found that they were empty. Somehow, the camp had been completely abandoned, and the Naha were nowhere to be found. This story has been a part of Dene oral tradition for a very long time, and the mystery of exactly what happened to the Naha has captivated countless listeners for years, further adding to the mystique of the valley. I mentioned earlier that the legend of the Headless Valley has been covered countless times by various people, and the Naha are often the first on the list of usual suspects for whoever might be killing folk and lopping off heads within the Nahanni Valley. They tell us that the Naha, which according to local elders means the people who inhabit the mountains and valley, were a mysterious, violent, warlike people, clad in thick sheep-hide armor, armed to the teeth, who were incredibly hostile to everyone, especially outsiders. They tell us that, according to Dene tradition, they suddenly vanished one day, never to be seen again. Nevertheless, some say, they are still responsible for all those grisly deaths in their former territory. Either a few groups survived the sudden rapture of their people and continue to live in the deepest, most remote parts of the valley, or they wander the valley as vengeful spirits, beheading those who get too close to the valley's legendary gold. Our second usual suspect is the Wahila, a cryptozoological creature that some say prowls the frozen wastes of the Canadian North. The wahila is essentially a giant white wolf, similar to the now extinct dire wolf. The word giant is subjective, with some saying it's nothing more than a larger-than-average gray wolf, no more than 2.5 feet to the shoulders and weighing less than 200 pounds. Others take it to mean that it's a different creature entirely, with wide, flat ears and a mouth that's twice the size of a human head, if not bigger, making it all too easy to snatch the heads and the lives of those who unknowingly wander too far into their territory. Now, I'm not here to debunk or pick apart anyone's theories, but I do feel that facts matter, and that a bit of cultural context is important if we want to understand the folklore of the Nahanni beyond the spooky. First, the entirety of the Naha people didn't just disappear one night, and they weren't especially dangerous. Like the Athapascan word Nahanni, Naha could just be a catch-all term for people who live in the West, and in this case meant a people known locally as the Mountain Dene. Many outsiders who roamed the Nahanni wrote about encountering, speaking, trading with, and even having tea with the Naha throughout the early 20th century. Sure, they might have raided other groups from time to time, but more often than not, they seemed like perfectly nice, normal people. The idea that the Naha people suddenly vanished isn't just wrong. It's similar to the common and damaging misconception that the Mayan and Aztec people of Mesoamerica suddenly disappeared, leaving their empty cities behind. The truth is that they simply became part of the communities and cultures around them. They might not exist politically, but their descendants live on. So what is the story about then? Well, unless the actual Dene storytellers tell us otherwise, we should take it at face value. A group of mountain Dene were in camp one day, and then they weren't. Maybe their scouts anticipated an incoming retaliation from the Dene. Maybe they decided to head back home after the raid and only took what they needed. Or maybe, as some have guessed, a significant number of the Naha suffered from an outbreak of meningitis or some other disease, leading to a mass abandonment of infected camps. And this oral tradition is a way of preserving that history. We don't know, but there are two things that we can say for certain. An entire people didn't just magically vanish one day, and they certainly didn't take people's heads for sport. As for the wahila, well, we have to be careful here too. The creature has quickly become a cryptozoological mascot for the northern wilds, but its name, as well as many of its supposed characteristics, seem to be either invented or imported. Contrary to what many believe, the name wahila isn't even indigenous to the area. In fact, no one is sure exactly where or who it came from, but it certainly wasn't the Nahanni region or even northern Canada. The name was popularized by famed Sasquatch hunter Ivan T. Sanderson, who once heard it used in reference to a story about a large white wolf that someone had encountered in northern Michigan. Later, a friend of Sanderson's was hunting along a tributary of the South Nahanni River when he too encountered a large white wolf with a wide head and shaggy hair. Speaking with others in the north, he came to learn that many had stories of encounters with a similarly large canine. Despite the encounters being roughly 3,000 kilometers apart, Sanderson saw fit to declare that his friend had encountered a wahila, and ever since, it has become increasingly difficult to ascertain which details are authentic folklore and which are total fantasy. There are indeed stories of large, menacing wolves in Dene and Inuit tradition, namely the Amarok, an enormous lone wolf that some suggest might stem from oral traditions of actual encounters with direwolves before they went extinct over 10,000 years ago. But there's very little out there to suggest that the so-called wahila of the Nahanni Valley is anything more than a wolf of unusual size. The third and final entry on our list of usual suspects is a group that is sometimes conflated with the Naha, and this is where things get really interesting. Part 6. The Nakanni. Imagine it's a pleasant summer night in the early 1900s, and you're sitting around a Dene campfire. The fire is crackling, and a few people are chatting about their day when a soft whistling pierces the air. Your companions stop and listen. It comes again, somewhere ahead of you in the darkness surrounding the camp. It's not a bird, it's not the wind, it's a voice. A moment later, another whistle comes in answer from somewhere behind you. You turn to look, but see nothing but a wall of trees and darkness. A third whistle comes, then a fourth. You're surrounded. You look back to the people around the fire and see faces full of panic. Others are just a blur as you watch them scramble back to their shelters to check on their sleeping children. The whistling that you just heard is a sound that they've been dreading their entire lives, because it means two terrifying things. The Nahanni are nearby, and their children are in danger. A lot of modern books, videos, and podcasts describe the Nahanni, sometimes known as the Nukluk, as vicious, primitive, cave-dwelling, man-eating creatures. Some early settlers in the area wrote of legendary giants with red eyes and hairy bodies who would torment the locals. Using a modern, conspiracy-tinged, cryptozoological perspective, many compare them to beings like the Sasquatch or Yeti, just a lot more homicidal. Flesh and blood creatures, all too eager to rip the head clean off your shoulders. But the reality seems to be a little more nuanced. Athabascan-speaking people cover a large amount of territory in the north, from the shores of Alaska to Hudson's Bay. Across that vast amount of land, the various communities all have their own stories of the Nahanni. According to a number of sources, Nahanni is an Athabascan word that translates to woodsman or bushman. Contextually, the meaning has often been described as being closer to bad man or wild man, but exactly what that means can vary. The Nahanni have been described by different people across the north as something akin to a spirit of the forest, a threatening man-like creature, and, quote, more of a human figure than a supernatural one, end quote. In some narratives, the Nahanni are the spirits of people who have gotten lost in the woods, or men and women who lost their minds to extreme hunger during a famine. Having lost their minds, they wander into the woods where they transform into dark servants of Giyek, a spirit of death. Most reports, however, suggest that the Nahanni are simply people. Solitary, often half-starved, and completely anonymous, they live in the wilderness outside the safety and security of a group, sometimes by choice, but more often by force after committing a crime and being banished from their community. Essentially, outlaws in the original sense of the word. Cut off from society, they survive by using a supernatural amount of iku, essentially a profound understanding of the natural world and its power, and by raiding camps, attacking lone hunters, and kidnapping women and children to either absorb into their group, enslave, or, according to some stories, consume. They are the quintessential outsider, the danger at the edge of the forest, and sometimes the boogeyman that your parents warn you about. Don't go hunting alone, and don't go out after dark, or the Nahanni will get you. Intriguingly, the Nahanni were only considered a threat during the warmer months, and many early settler accounts of living with Athabascan people tell how, by late summer, a complete and continual terror would occasionally envelop the camp as word spread that the Nahanni were lurking somewhere nearby. The strongest evidence of their presence was the sound of whistling at night, the Nahanni's main choice for communication, and thus a major taboo for the Dene. So, who are the Nahanni really? Myth, monster, or man? The best answer might be all three. Some early anthropologists suggested that stories of the Nahanni were used to collectively remember a dangerous group of outsiders who once, long ago, threatened the community. But in the 1900s, in certain areas of the north, that threat was still very real. The Dene communities in that general area were often harassed and attacked by other indigenous groups in the south, many of whom went so far as to kidnap and enslave their women and children. So it makes sense that Nahanni could be synonymous with any number of dangerous outsiders. It also makes sense that the Nahanni would only be dangerous in the spring and summer, as the heavy winter snow and overwhelming cold would have made it nearly impossible for raiding parties to venture north. In her article, The Enemy of Every Tribe, Bushman Images and Northern Athapascan Narratives, Professor Ellen Basso declares very plainly that, quote, Bushmen are without question Dene, or human beings, rather than the devils, spirits, monsters, or demons they have usually interpreted to be. Bushmen are persons who have become dehumanized by their isolation, end quote. So how did the Nahanni become synonymous with Sasquatch or Bigfoot? It seems like it comes from a few Nahanni descriptions sourced from the Athapascan-speaking people further to the west, in Alaska and the Yukon, who described the Nahanni as looking like anyone else except for their giant feet. Now, that sounds pretty intriguing until you read further. You could tell they had giant feet, they said, because they wore giant shoes, the prints of which you could see in the thawing ice and mud during the spring. Now that might conjure images of something akin to Sasquatch wandering the subarctic, until you learn that some groups, like the Athapascan-speaking Tahltan people, quote, had no knowledge of snowshoes until the end of the 19th century, end quote. There are some stories that tell us the Nahanni are particularly dirty, hairy, and masculine, and that some people who were kidnapped by them and later managed to escape became similar in nature. But they were, decidedly, still very much human, and were able to change back. Over time, however, we can imagine these stories being adapted and changed to reflect not just the behavior and appearance of outsiders, but behaviors and appearances that were unwanted within the community. It's human nature to villainize, demonize, and eventually dehumanize those who aren't like us. And it's likely that, at least in some communities, real people became abstract creatures. Once the outsiders caught wind of the stories, the details changed again, and the stories were shared, without context, with a new and eager audience. Much of what is reported about the Nahanni comes from prospectors and outdoorsmen who cobbled together what they could without a fluent command of the language. Hunters and trappers who admitted to changing, embellishing, and downright inventing details for entertainment or marketing purposes. And last but not least, a priest who literally went insane. You can go back through the journals, government reports, and newspaper articles from the last century and trace how the stories changed and got weirder as they were shared, built upon, and embellished again and again. In my opinion, you can see clear influences from early science fiction, like Arthur Doyle's 1912 smash hit, The Lost World, about a remote and isolated land filled with prehistoric plants and animals, as well as a tribe of vicious ape-like creatures who are at odds with the local indigenous population. Stories of lush, tropical valleys and hoards of gold greedily protected by violent, secretive tribes was a consistent topic in the newspapers of the 1930s, when northern settlers were eager to lure wealthy trophy hunters, hopeful miners, and eager explorers to a veritable Shangri-La. After World War II, as soldiers returned from the South Pacific with stories of headhunting tribes in places like Borneo and Papua New Guinea, the idea that headhunters lived in the impossible hot spring jungles of the Northwest Territories began to spread. From the late 1960s onward, as cryptids and monsters have grown in popularity, the hairy, club-wielding Nukluk, clearly confused with stories of the Nahanni, emerged from the writings of a single cryptozoologist, while the vicious Wahila leapt from a posthumous, somewhat obscure article about direwolves, and is now said to roam the Nahanni and hunt herds of moose in northern Ontario. Needless to say, some of the stories that have made their way to the mainstream might need not just a grain, but an entire shaker of salt. Rather than insist that the indigenous people of the North are dealing with some sort of hairy hominid or prehistoric caveman, I think we should consider why these stories are shared and what they're meant to convey. Professor Ellen Basso describes how, even as late as the 1970s, Nahanni stories were used by the Dene people in the Mackenzie Valley, in part, to keep children quiet and close to camp. "We want them to think hard about how to live in the bush," she quotes one local woman, "even if we have to scare them sometimes." The Nahanni also exhibit antisocial behaviors. Unruly, forceful, and feral, they are examples of inappropriate and unacceptable actions within the community. In these stories, the Nahanni become the monstrous creature in the forest, symbolizing the dangers that lurk outside the community and the violent beast that lurks in us all, our wild nature. Perhaps most importantly, the Nahanni can represent the natural world. In the north, Professor Basso explains, springtime is when the world is at its most dangerous. It is, to the Dene of the Mackenzie River, Nadio Nise, when the world swells. A time of dramatic change in the landscape, resulting in enormous excitement, tension, and danger. The Nahanni are, in turn, quote, the very embodiment of spring, a solitary stranger of unpredictable but typically dangerous habits who is in command of extraordinary iku, or medicine power, end quote. This, I think, is what's missing from all those books, articles, and episodes about the Nahanni Valley. Authenticity and a bit of honesty. Folks continue to respin the same old sensationalized settler yarns, using a few scraps here and there from the local Dene culture, but mostly relying on yellow journalism, mid-century adventure marketing, and an aesthetic ripped right from the pages of jungle action comics to craft an entertaining story of a northern wild full of ancient curses, cryptids, ape men, and aliens. Another Canadian book was published just in the last few months that contains a chapter on the Nahanni Valley, and it goes through the same tired old talking points that have barely changed since hitting the tabloids of the 1930s and 40s. But there's so much more that deserves to be discovered and talked about. It's unlikely that any actual bush people or wild men killed Willie and Frank McLeod, or, for that matter, any of the others who died or disappeared in the Nahanni. But there still could be some truth behind that idea. In many Dene stories about encounters with the Nahanni, the hero must use their wits, their survival skills, their bushcraft, their iku, to overcome the Nahanni and survive the encounter. If your knowledge is lacking, your fate is sealed. I love that idea of exchange and balance, that you have to spend time in the wild to truly know how to survive within it, and fight against the terrors that live in its deepest shadows. But if you go too far, if you lose your connection to your people, then you can get absorbed by it, transformed by it, and swallowed whole. A fate, perhaps, that befell May Lafferty. If the Nahanni are the embodiment of the spring, the most dangerous and wild season in the north, then, in a way, it could be said that the Nahanni were responsible for the dark fates of people like the McLeods, Martin Jorgensen, Phil Powers, and May Lafferty. Whatever was actually behind their deaths or disappearances, starvation, exposure, insanity, mysterious killers, or bloodthirsty creatures, each of them was challenged by the wilderness, and each tried their best to survive. But the swell of the world overtook them, and, in the end, Gieg, the spirit of death, came for them all. The Nahanni region became a protected national park in 1976 and was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1978. Prospecting and hunting is strictly prohibited, but activities like guided ecotourism and whitewater rafting are bringing in more outsiders than ever before. Thankfully, there have been no modern reports of any beheadings in the park. I'm not the first to talk about the legend of the Headless Valley, and I certainly won't be the last. These stories are too mysterious, too compelling. The gruesome and intriguing details of starvation, decapitation, and madness are just as captivating today as they were at the turn of the 20th century. So much so that they've captured the imaginations not just of Canadians, but of people worldwide. Yesterday's tall tales, tabloids, and yellow journalism are today's YouTube videos, clickbait articles, and hastily researched books. still reporting mythical body counts and discredited details as if they were facts. Pierre Berton found precious little on his 1947 visit to the Nahanni Valley. No tropical paradise, no mammoths, monstrous wolves, homicidal hominids, or cave-dwelling creatures. Thankfully, no bodies. Just a few crumbling cabins and an old, faded photograph of Rita Hayworth. Of course, he only stayed for an hour or two, and it was in the depths of winter. And we know now, thanks to the folklore, that while the winter cold can certainly kill you, it's the warmer months, when the world swells, that you're really in danger. However, one thing did catch his eye. As Berton and his companions were leaving the Headless Valley, 1,000 feet above the frozen Liard River, they looked southeast through the aircraft's frost-covered windows and saw what he called a final symbol. Quote, "There on the horizon lay a magnificent range of rose-colored mountains. They were higher than any mountains I had ever seen, and as jagged and ruthless as the Nahanni's peaks. And each of these Everests were painted a Walt Disney color of rich red rose. Strangest of all, this range appeared on no map of the land. I looked at the mountains again, and as I watched, they began to ripple in the sunset, as if one were watching them through a sheet of water. The rippling increased until great wavy shadows seemed to be dashing across the mountain slopes at express train speed. Then, suddenly, the mysterious mountain range was gone." End quote. It was a mirage. A fitting final glimpse of a legendary valley where there are still plenty of histories and mysteries to uncover, and where, sometimes, few things are what they seem.